Good, Vachshvat over. We're on the bottom of Lamed Tes Amud Aleph 39a4. Amar. So we're going to go on a bit of a tangent. We've been talking about Mara, and we're going to talk about Mara as it relates to Kilayim. Kilayim is a prohibition against planting different types of things together, and we start with the statements, which we're going to spend a little bit of time trying to understand. It's a little bit cryptic, so we're going to need to analyze it to try to understand exactly what was being said. So Amar Rabba Bar Funa Marav, Yirakush Amar Chacham Shal Miutz Behem Yidei Chavasu B'Pesach, the vegetables, which we discussed yesterday, which the rabbi spoke about, which said that a person fulfills their obligation for Mar on Pesach, Kulan Israel Baruga Achas, they could all be planted in one bed. Okay, so again, all the vegetables which the Chacham spoke about when it comes to Mar, they can be planted in one bed. Now, what does that mean? Lememra, Deleisbu Mishim Kilayim, does he mean to say there's no Kilayim whatsoever? That there's no Kilayim issue over here? Must have Rabba. Rabba asks from the following Mishnah. That can't be. Why? Because the Mishnah says Chazeres veChazeres Galan. Chazeres, okay, one of the types of Mar, and Chazeres Galan, a similar type of Mar. Olshin ve'olshei Sada. Olshin and wild Olshin. Krishin u'krishei Sada. Cultivated leeks and wild leeks. Kusbar ve'kusbar Sada. Cultivated coriander and wild coriander. Chardo ve'charo mitzri. Mustard and Egyptian mustard. Udlas mitzri v'armutza, and Egyptian gourd and ramutza, which is a different type of gourd. Inim kilayim zevizeh. They do not constitute kilayim one with another. Okay, so the simplest read of that Mishnah, which is what Rabbi is about to say, Chazeres ve'chazeres Galan in. So the implication is that Chazeres and Chazeres Galan, those are able to be planted together. However, Chazeres ve'olshin lo, but Chazeres with the next category, right, that cannot be planted together, which tells you that these things are indeed Kilayim, right? In other words, our first attempted interpretation of Rabbi Rav Huna Marav was to say that these things are not Kilayim. But the simplest understanding of this Mishnah is that the Mishnah is saying that no, Chazeres and Chazeres Galan, Ulshin, wild Ulshin, those are not Kilayim. But if you put them together, Chazeres and Ulshin, those would be Kilayim. V'chitin, and if you want to tell me, no, maybe I'm reading the Mishnah wrong, maybe the Mishnah really should be read, that all those things together are not Kilayim. And that's what the Mishnah said, Ein Kilayim Zavizeh, they're not Kilayim. V'amarav, Rav, who is actually the author of this original statement, said, Zugas Kani. The way to read the Mishnah is that it's actually saying pairs, that there's no problem of them being in pairs. The pairs of Chazeres, the pairs of Olshin, the pairs of coriander, those could be done together, but don't read the Mishnah the way we just read it. So clearly the Rabbi Bar Huna, in the name of Rav, was not coming to tell you that all the different maras are not an issue of Kilayim. So what was he telling us? So attempt number 2, Man Israel to Rav. What did Rav mean when he said they're all allowed to be planted in one bed? Israel Kolchas, and they be planted in accordance with their halacha. What is their halacha? So there's this unique way of planting, which we're going to quote in a moment, which is that if you have a bed, a small bed, you could put one seed over here, one seed over here, one seed over here, one seed over here, and one seed in the middle. That's what it means. So Gemara says, if that's the case, now Lamed Testament base 39b1. Let's say you have a bed that is 6 tvachim by 6 tvachim. Zar mesocha chamisha zaran. You're allowed to plant within it 5 types of seeds. Arba al arba ruchos aruga, 4 on each wall. 1, 2, 3, 4 on the 4 sides. And 1 in the middle. That could be done. Okay, well, how exactly? Bottom line is then it's separated enough, and you could plant it that way. So if that's what Rabbi Bar Huna was coming to tell you in the name of Rav. It's an mefurish, it's an explicit Mishnah. You wouldn't need him to tell us that. Rav is an Amora. He wouldn't have to state an explicit Mishnah. So maybe the Gemara says, okay, so maybe he's going to tell you the following. Maybe what Rav's coming to teach me is that if you read the Mishnah alone, you would have said only when it's seeds. What are seeds? Seeds are things which germinate, meaning you plant the seed disintegrates, and then something grows. Maybe that's the only. Maybe you would have thought, had you read the Mishnah, you would have said, oh, it's only applicable to seeds. But when it comes to vegetables like, the Mara vegetables are typically vegetables like we spoke about the onion in the past, where you plant the onion and then it multiplies. So in such a case, so if that type of thing, you may have thought that the Mishnah was only talking about seeds, but not talking about vegetables. And Rav's going to teach you, no, it also applies to vegetables. So Gemara says, wait, Lememra di'rakos alima mizraim. The only way that would make sense, you'd make this mistake, that Rav would have to come and tell you this, is if it's so that vegetables are more vigorous, meaning they draw more nourishment from a wider area than seeds. In other words, like this: you read the Mishnah says, oh, it's only. You say it says seeds. Oh, it's only seeds. Maybe if it's vegetables, you would need more space. But the only way that you would even think that, right? And then Rav would come and say, no, vegetables are the same thing. But the only way to even think that if vegetables actually draw more nourishment, right? Because what's going on with Kilayim? Kilayim is you have to separate the seeds one from the next, or the vegetable one from the next, so that they're not drawing from the same exact place, because then they're actually all being mixed together. So the only way it makes sense to make this mistake is if vegetables actually draw more sustenance than seeds. But the problem is we learned the exact opposite. But not kol minei zarim in zarim baruga achas, kol minei rakos zarim baruga achas. We learned in the Mishnah, Mishnah Kilayim, which says that any type of zeraim, of seeds, are able to be are not able to be planted in one bed. Okay, but vegetables can be. So you see very clearly that vegetables are actually draw less nourishment. So you would never actually made this mistake. So Manatima Hanimir Mar means Ram. So Gemara says, okay, you're right. Maybe what Rav was coming to teach us is that you would have thought that marar is zeraim, is a seed, and Kamashmalan, he's coming to tell you that it's actually a vegetable. So Gemara says, Ram Slakadaitach, would you actually have thought that marar is a vegetable? And would you have thought that marar is a seed? That can't be. But Tanya Rakos, our Mishnah said, these are the vegetables with which you discharge your obligation. Clearly, it's a vegetable. But Tanya Barkbar Yerakos. And when we have a brisa, Barkbar Tata brisa, and it says these are the vegetables. With Tanya Debei Shmuel Yerakos, and Shmuel Tata brisa, and it started off with the words these are vegetables. So over and over again, we have Tanaim saying that these marar things are actually all vegetables. So Gemara says, okay, here's the final answer, the one we're going to stick with. Chazeres Sitzri Chalei. The reason Rava teaches anything is because of Chazeres. Since Chazeres eventually hardens, and if it hardens, it's actually going to get more. It puts deeper roots, and the roots are going to actually pull many more nutrients. So you would have thought that when it comes to, granted, we know that mar in general is vegetables, but since it gets hardened, you may have thought that you need to give it more space, and you can't plant it all in that small space. Lav Amar Rav Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, similar, had not Rav Yossi the son of Chanina said that a stalk of cabbage that became hard, you expand an empty space around it, a base rova, meaning a larger space. You see that something will eventually get hardened, you give it extra space. Here too, with regard to chazeres, you may have thought since it eventually is going to harden, you have to give it more space. Kamashma Rav says that until it hardens, you don't have to give it more space. That's where I was going to teach you that it's a regular vegetable, and the regular vegetable could be planted in that special fashion of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you may have thought the chazer, since it gets hard and therefore has deeper and stronger roots, you may have had to give it more space. The Gemara says, no, you don't have to do so. That's what Rabbi's coming to teach us. Okay, now the Gemara says, Yotzim Mehen Bein Lachem Innovation, you're allowed to discharge your obligation whether they are these mara things are moist or dry. Rav Chisda Lashon al Bekelach. This halacha that it could be done moist or dry is only for the stalk. When it comes to the leaves, if they're moist, meaning if they're fresh, then yes, they're acceptable as mar. But if they dried out, you're not allowed to use them. Why? Because if they dry out, they actually lose some of their intensity and they're not such strong mar. Ask the Gemara, wait a second. It's very hard to read that into the Mishnah because what Rav Chis is coming to do is as follows. Our Mishnah said, the marar, you could fulfill your obligation whether they're moist or dry. The next line of the Mishnah says that you could also use their stalks. Rav Chisda is saying that when it said moist or dry, it was only going on the stalks. The problem is that the statement of moist or dry is actually before the statement of on the stalks. So how do you read that? So Gemara says, so no, this is the way to read the Mishnah. The Mishnah was actually explaining things. Kikitani ben lachem innovation akelach. So basically the way to read the Mishnah is like this. These are the different types of maras. Then it says moist or dry, and when is it true moist or dry? On the stalks. That's the way to read the Mishnah, and therefore Rav Chisda is saying it's really only going on stalks. Meis, we ask a question. Yotze Behen, we're 39b2. Ubekel Shehen. We have a brisa which says you could fulfill your obligation with them and with their stalks. Bein lachem innovation, whether they're moist or dry, to Rameir. These are the words of Rameir. Cham Omrim, Lachem Yotze Behen. Okay, bottom line, let's just pause over here. So you see very clearly, Rameir is saying that stalks, you can fulfill your obligation with them and their stalks, whether they are moist or dry. It sounds like moist or dry is going on both on them and their stalks, right? So don't tell me that it's just going on stalks. It sounds like very clearly from Rameir, you could fulfill your obligation with them, meaning the leaves, and their stalks, whether they are moist or dry. Seemingly going on everything that was mentioned above, meaning both the stalks and the leaves. Okay, but let's just finish the brisa before we come back to the question. You fulfill your obligation if they're moist. If they're dry, you do not fulfill your obligation. Both Rameir and the Chum agree. That if they're withered is like between moist and dry, then you fulfill your obligation of lo kavushim, not if they're preserved, meaning if they're put into like vinegar to last for a while, velo shlukin, or if they're stewed, velo mevushalin, or if they're cooked, close, whatever. There's the rule, kol sheish bo tamar yotzmo, if they still have the taste of mar, you fulfill your obligation. V'kol she'im tamar into bo, if because through this processing it loses some of its intensity, it doesn't have a taste of mar, you do not fulfill your obligation. But the bottom line is again that the opening line of that brisa said, with them and their stalks, whether they're moist or dry. So Gemara says, Targuma akelach. Okay, again, you could say that the way to read that brisa was as follows. You can fulfill your obligation with them and their stalks. Regarding their stalks, whether they're moist or dry. That's the way to read it. Okay, Tanur, fine. The bottom line is we're not able to disprove Rav Chisda, and that's actually the way we learn. We learn like Rav Chisda, that the only mar you're allowed to use is if it's moist. You can't use dried out mar. Okay, Tanur Rabbanan, in Yotzim Mehem Kibushim. You have never brisa, although the brisa Bab said everyone agrees you're allowed to use withered. This brisa says you're not allowed to use withered. Okay. Mishum Rabbi Lezer Rabbi Tzadok Amru Yotz Behen Kemushin Rabbi Lezer the son of Rabbi Tzadok says you are allowed to use withered. Are you allowed to use Meiser Sheni Marar in Yerushalayim, right? We had this discussion about matzah in the past. Now we're asking this question about marar. Regarding within the view of Rabbi Kiva, there's no question because Rabbi Kiva again said you can even fulfill your obligation with matzah of Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim. Hashda matzah deraisa nafik. If you fulfill your obligation with matzah, which is Meiser Sheni deraisa. Why is it Meiser Sheni deraisa? Because when it comes to Meiser Sheni deraisa biblically is only something obligated for fruit and for the grains. And those are biblical Meiser Sheni, and he says nonetheless you are able to fulfill your obligation since it could become tummy, then you can eat it everywhere. Therefore, he says you fulfill your obligation. Marar, which is a vegetable, which really, therefore, there is no obligation. There is no biblical obligation to eat it only in Yerushalayim. So for sure, if he held by something which is biblically mandated to eat in Yerushalayim, you fulfill your obligation. So for sure, for Marar, when we have this question, Rabbi Yosef Glili, who said that matzah baked in from Meiser Sheni flour cannot be used for matzah. What's the halacha? Matzah d'oraisa hu d'lo nafik. Maybe it's only by biblical mitzvah that you can't fulfill your obligation. Lamar d'rabbanan nafik. Maybe when it's rabbinic, you could fulfill your obligation. And then we have this principle that whenever the rabbis institute something, they always frame it, they always enact it around the biblical law, and they always use the same model. Amarava, mistabra, matzah mar. It's logical to say matzah mar have the same halachos. Okay, let's start the next Mishnah. We'll stop over here. Ain't sure as a more sun l'tanigulam. You're not allowed to soak bran for chickens because if you soak it, it's going to turn into chametz v'chot, and you're allowed to scald the bran, and then use that flour, the bran flour, the bran for baking bread. Okay, because if you scald it, then it prevents it from coming chametz. So a woman's not allowed to soak bran, take with her to the bath, because basically again it's going to become chametz. She's allowed to rub it on her skin, dry bran, even if she's sweaty. The sweat is something which is not going to cause leavening. The person is not allowed to chew grains of wheat and place them on the wound. Because saliva does cause things to become chametz. We will pick up in Gemara, God willing, tomorrow. Have a great day.